Today I'm talking with Stevi Góngoroa from Authentic Movements. I first found Stevi and Authentic Movements during the pandemic. My goal for the pandemic as a yoga teacher was to deepen my teaching practice by looking at and studying different teachers online, seeing the way that they put together classes, sequencing, the flows, all that fun stuff. So immediately I was drawn to Authentic Movements and the way that Stevi and Aaron and Bianca were presenting the practice of yoga. So today we're going to talk about how Stevi got to the point of where she's teaching yoga, all the trials and tribulations of that, and also her approach to yoga and how she and Authentic Movements have developed this beautiful, inventive style and while still making yoga approachable to everybody. Love this conversation. Love talking about yoga in general. It's one of my favorite things to nerd out about. So hope you enjoy the conversation. We'll see you on the other side. But first, a message from our sponsor. Góngora is a gorgeous meditation and healing center, offering daily in-person and virtual services to help bring you back to the center of who you truly are. They serve through a collective of practitioners, healers, and teachers, offering daily meditation classes, one-on-one healing sessions, workshops, personal ceremonies, and private events, plus corporate and team training, all with mindfulness at the core. The center itself is located in the heart of downtown Spokane. Every part of it was built, designed, and curated for you to drop into your calm place. They have a large community space for daily meditation classes and workshops, as well as 2 one-on-one healing rooms, a community kitchen to gather for tea, plus a well-stocked apothecary for you to gather all of your self-care and ritual needs. Hannah Talbot, the owner and founder of Góngora, dreamed of opening this space for years. It is her ultimate manifestation, and she cannot wait to share it with those in the Spokane community, but also through the virtual ethers, wherever you may be. Pop in for a class today. You can follow them on Instagram to book and stay up to date. Check out the website, the full schedule, meet the practitioners, and view all the offerings. Visit them at anamkarahealing.center. Anamkara, may you be nourished and ignited. Our healing journey can be difficult and might feel lonely at times. That's why I love sound baths. When we can get together in a community, we intrinsically support and feel supported by others. And that combined energy can help us go deeper into our own healing journeys. And all you have to do is just lay there for 1 hour and listen to beautiful healing sounds. I'm a sound healing practitioner, and I hold sound baths on a regular basis in the greater Seattle area. You can find my next sound baths on my website at adamrealhealing.com. That's Adam, A-D-A-M, Real, R-I-E-H-L, Healing, H-E-A-L-I-N-G.com. AdamRealHealing.com. Your healing is worth your time. And now an uninterrupted podcast with Stevi Góngoroa. All right, welcome back to our show. Today I'm very excited to have on Stevi Góngoroa. Stevi is one of the 3 people that I know of that have that are part of this group called Authentic Movements. Authentic Movements was is a teacher training group that I personally found during COVID times. So just a little bit of my reasoning for finding you, and the reason why I love and appreciate what y'all do so much is that when COVID happened for all of us, it put a stop on our lives. And at that point in time, I'd been teaching for close to 5 years, and I love my practice, love my teaching, love my taking practice. And when things stopped, it put a pause on everything. I couldn't go take classes. I could barely teach, at that point in time. So I decided to dive internally into my own personal teaching practice. And started to look at different teachers that I really loved initially, but never had put time into. And some of those teachers were like Patrick Beach and Dylan Werner and, Keno McGregor and things like that had just interesting styles that they like to teach. And through that, through those names, those were the names that are already on my head. Through those names, I found Authentic Movements and Instagram. And immediately, like the first thing I saw you guys doing, and I can't remember who it was, which the 3 of y'all it was, but somebody was, it was just so inventive and so inversion based and so explorative. And it was right around the time that I was just the animalistic yoga was kind of in a peripheral of my understanding. And so it seemed like y'all were mixing this kind of animalistic yoga with inversions and with inventive sequencing, and everything still seemed safe and amazing. And I'm like, what in the hell is this shit? Like, where has this been? And of course, you guys are in Costa Rica. So I'm like, okay, got to find my way to Costa Rica now. But Stevi, just first off, thank you so much for doing what you do and for pushing the idea of what yoga is and what the body can do in a very, very safe way. Thank you for your contribution to yoga. You guys are awesome. I'm so happy to know that yoga is being safely developed in a different way to meet different types of body types and different types of explorative practices. So first off, just thanks for being here. Appreciate you.
Well, thank you, Adam, for inviting me, and I am thrilled to be here as well. It's been an adventure, not just the last few years of the pandemic, but the entire creation and life and changes of authentic movements since the beginning. And it is wonderful always to hear that people do resonate with us because we are weird, and that's not for everybody, but it's certainly for some people. And we like being funky and we like pushing the boundary of what is yoga and how can we add playfulness to practice and how can we bring some level of accessibility to complex movements by breaking it down. So it's wonderful to hear that people out there are still interested in that because we love doing it.
Oh man, two of my favorite quotes that I love that I hear yoga teachers say is, "It's a yoga practice, not a yoga perfect," which I love that because it adds that layer of fun back to it because there's so much stoicness that can happen in a yoga class, and I'm working on this, and there's this focus that happens, but we're still playful, right? And then the other thing that I personally love saying in practice is be playful with your practice. Like get playful with it. Explore it, right? Especially if you come to a hatha class. Hatha is what we call the shortened Bikram style up in the Northwest. So if you go to a hatha practice, like it's going to be more or less the same practice every time. If you dial yourself in, you can really get playful with your practice in a hatha practice because you know exactly what's going to happen. So you can really kind of like tailor your practice to that. But once you get into like an explorative vinyasa, power, or movement based practice, there's so much playfulness that can happen in that, in just like adults being on their hands, adults like laughing because we got kind of in a weird pose. There's body noises that happen in yoga. Like it can be really fun and just like comical. It doesn't have to be all stoic. It can be. Does have that layer of it, and I do definitely fall into that at times. But it's practices like what you guys are teaching and what I watch from you guys that really reminds me how playful yoga is and can be.
Well, I think you really latched onto a keyword there in playful or playfulness. And I agree that there are places for a serious practice. And I love getting serious on my mat. And I know Erin, one of my co-teachers, she has a serious Dharma practice where it's not playful, it's very serious. And she loves that aspect. But when we started realizing that people come to us for unusual transitions, for inversions, for long creative flows, all of which can be daunting, especially if you're new to this. Just adding in that level of lightheartedness and play seemed like an essential element so that we could avoid some of the frustration that comes with this and just remind people that none of this is necessary. It's not necessary to do handstands. It's not necessary to be able to transition between 5 different arm balances and then jump back to this perfect chaturanga. Is it fun? Sometimes we can make it more fun by just getting a little weird with it and not worrying about the specifics so much while we're still keeping the body safe.
That's beautiful. And especially coming from such an inventive teacher as yourself, that reassurance that it doesn't always have to be inversion. You don't always have to play with all of your toys all the time. Like you can have your toy box and like, okay, those are all the toys I can play with. But if I do everything as an inversion, then maybe I'm negating something else in my practice. So, but giving that freedom to explore it, right? So here's an opportunity for you to get inverted or to try something different. But there's also a very safe traditional transition that you can make your way through from here too, as you're learning your body and as you're building the strength to maybe get into that other transition that we're teaching as well. And that's teaching to all levels, right? And I love that. We teach to all levels. Everybody can play the game. There's not just one set of rules. It's how your body, how your body receives the content that's being put out there. And then there's always a way to do it,
Absolutely. And I think myself, Erin, and Bianca, we all love inversions in our own way. Mm-hmm. And sure, we sprinkle them a lot into our practice. And I have a background in some gymnastics and aerial arts as well. So that's where some of my interest comes from. But we have plenty of people within the Authentic Movements family, whether they're assistant teachers or just people participating in the programs, who don't love inversions. And that's totally fine. As you said, a lot of the work for inverting, focusing on these little components, and even just the proprioception of where our body is in space will feed into the rest of the practice as well. So when we do some kind of training or all levels thing, unless it's specifically directed at inversions, we add in components of getting upside down and finding float. But we also remind people that the actual getting upside down and the actual floating, that's optional. That's for fun. And the work that they're putting on the mat can benefit other parts of their practice as well as their life outside of the mat.
Yeah, most definitely. So how did you, so where did yoga kind of enter into your life? How did you find your way to your initial yoga practice, let alone the advancedness of where you're at now?
Sure. Okay. Well, it's been somewhat of a long journey with ups and downs. I have always been somewhat of an athlete. I started gymnastics really young, and that was one of my main areas along with dance when I was younger. And we had yoga that was sprinkled in, especially when I was more towards my high school years. I remember we had to take yoga stretching classes, but that is what my mind associated yoga with. It was
Mm.
more of a simple hatha style, longer holds where people would just say a posture name. And once you knew what that posture was, you would make that general shape and you would look for a stretch. And that wasn't necessarily something that interested me. And it wasn't until later that I discovered that that's just one very small corner of the yoga world. And it really took my transition into aerial arts, which happened during and shortly after college. I practiced and also taught pole and
Mm.
lyra and a little bit of silks. And I loved that. And part of that reminded me of my world in gymnastics, which was, push your body, make these shapes, get crazy, do what you have to do to get it done. And that was wonderful
Mm.
until it really wasn't, right? And I don't think I was really balancing out my exercise routine, and I was searching for these shapes without thinking about engagements and considering that all bodies are unique and different, even from the bony level. And I was on social media and I started to see all of these yoga accounts and these yoga practices that I had never thought of or considered as being within that wheelhouse of yoga. And there were creative flows, there was inversions, and I had some handstand experience, obviously, from gymnastics and aerials, but I could walk around on my hands. I couldn't hold a handstand. I couldn't do these massively controlled transitions, like folding my legs into a pretzel of lotus and then lowering down onto my arms. And that was fascinating to me that this was even considered within the realm of yoga. And through that, I really started to explore and go to local studios. At that time, I was living in Austin, Texas. So there
Mm.
was a pretty good yoga scene there about, that was about 10 or 15 years ago now.
Okay.
And I started to explore other aspects of yoga outside of the physical asana practice. And that was interesting to me. Breath work was interesting to me. Meditation was interesting to me. I started taking trainings and slowly I transitioned away from aerials. I brought some of the yoga aspects into aerials to make my body feel a little bit better. But I really started to transition more to a daily yoga practice. And I would say that was about 12, 15 years ago that my life started to shift more towards yoga. And then I took a lot of trainings and did a lot of intensives, started teaching myself as far as workshops and traveling with Aaron. And now, now I feel like my practice has morphed into something that is yoga inspired, absolutely, but pulls from a lot of other experiences, such as my dance background, a little bit from my aerials background. I like sneaking in strength and conditioning work. I love kind of sampling other modalities. And so I know one of the complaints we get about authentic movements is like, this doesn't look like yoga. And it doesn't always look like traditional yoga, depending on what your specific definition of what traditional yoga is. But I love being playful. And for me, that comes with pulling from my dance background and getting a little bit weird, wacky, and kind of sneaking some things even from strength and conditioning, because I love that too. And my husband is really into that. So that's how it's all worked out. So that's been a bit of my journey.
Yeah.
I feel like my personal practice comes and goes. It is right now kind of peaking again, which is exciting. I had a child about almost 3 years ago. And so I focused most of my free time on filming content for trainings and doing trainings and things like that. And my personal practice for sure suffered having that time on the mat. And now I'm finally getting back to this place. It's like, okay, I can provide this content for others, but I can also find the space to practice for myself. So that's exciting.
That is exciting. And that's, as teachers, we do have a tendency to kind of not lose, but step away from our personal practice for a bit, especially when you're developing, when you're developing so much content and you're putting so much stuff out there, teacher trainings in general. I mean, I was, was part of a teacher training group up here in the Northwest for about 2 years after I got done with my teacher training personally, and it was one of the most amazing experiences for me because coming right out of teacher training, I practiced yoga for about 3 years before taking teacher training, and then went through the training, and I knew I was going to be a teacher as soon as the first class I took, but I wanted to really like understand myself and my practice. But being part of a teacher training group was one of the most amazing experiences because you're delivering the content over and over and over again. So it's really seeding in your own head, the transitions, the methodology, the philosophy behind yoga, like all the, how to keep people safe. And so it was beautiful to go over and over and over again, but holding that space and delivering that much content and demoing, especially I had to really get on the understanding that I have to demo on the other side. I was always demoing on my right side, and then I'm like walking around in a circle like Zoolander. I can't turn left. I'm like, what the hell's going on here? But there's so much energy that it takes out of you to hold that space and to be that person to develop and to deliver the knowledge that sometimes our practice does suffer a bit. So I'm so happy to hear that you're getting back to it because it's always there for us. It's always there waiting. And a lot of times too, I could maybe just assume by watching your practice on Instagram, you're a pretty intense person with your yoga practice. Like you push yourself a lot. And so a lot of times with that mentality, we don't give our body enough time to recover between our practices, especially if we're teaching and we're practicing and we're developing. So some of that forced time off might actually give your body the recuperation that it needs to really dive deeper into your yoga practice. So I totally feel that. There's something that you mentioned that I really love and I really want to unpack a little bit. And it's that what y'all are doing doesn't look like yoga all the time. And I both love and I hate that statement. I love the statement because let's push the boundaries, right? I love pushing the boundaries, and I hate the statement at the same time because there's also this idea, and I shouldn't say hate, but there's this idea that yoga should be pure for what it was, and now there's the idea that there's so much Western influence in yoga, like say goat yoga, for example, or naked yoga, or all these offshoots of yoga that for the purists, it's not yoga, but at the same time, like things progress, like life progresses. And right now we don't really have something else to call it, to associate it to something that people understand. So we call it yoga. And I'm not saying that what y'all are doing isn't yoga, but like we have to push the boundaries, right? And so like one of the examples I love for this is language, right? Language, it has developed massively over 2,000 years, right? It's still language. It still gets the point across. It still allows me to communicate with you in a way. It allows me to listen to others communicate in their own dialogue and maybe learn their way of speaking. But even though I don't understand, let's say Portuguese, I still understand it as a language and it's still being communicated some way. So yoga is very similar to that in me. Yoga's been around for thousands of years. Our bodies have changed in those thousands of years. Our understanding of movement has changed. Our understanding of how our breath has changed. So why don't we, I guess, why is it so looked down upon that we are progressing this art as well? And I get there's the purists out there, but, it's 2,000 years old. There's going to be some developments with it. So I don't know. So when people ask you about that, say this doesn't look like yoga, how do you respond to that, and how do you hold that space?
Well, I usually ask them what yoga looks like in their mind, because as you even said, there's these purists out there, but there's purists from many different lineages who would very strongly disagree with each other. And it's so interesting to me because yes, yoga as a practice, as a philosophy, as a lifestyle is this ancient thing. But this asana practice, even what many of the purists think about as a traditional practice, is fairly new. And there's a lot of debates and it's a controversial subject, but pulls from a variety of other modalities and movement practices as well. There weren't necessarily people thousands of years ago doing a dancing warrior sequence, even though those are very common things in a traditional practice today. Mm-hmm. And so this idea that there is like this one true line or this one true idea of what yoga is feels a little bit silly to me. And when you really ask people to dig in and ask them what yoga means to them, usually it becomes this more nuanced answer or this more existential question of, I'm actually not really sure. And I am fine if people think that authentic movements isn't really yoga. There's even a reason that we don't have yoga in the name, and that is that yes, we're absolutely yoga inspired. I I love and respect my time training in yoga and looking at a variety of different lineages and comparing them. But we have essentially moved somewhat outside of that by pulling from all of these different modalities, even just outside of the traditional yoga scope. And that's okay with me because, like you said, the world is progressing. I think that what people think of as traditional or these strict practices often were for a specific kind of body who wanted to practice on the daily, had this 2 hours to commit to being on the mat. And those are not the kinds of people who are practicing today. We have such a wide variety of practitioner coming to the mat. And this idea that we can give them this one formula and even these tiny little alignment cues that work for every single person is ridiculous. So I totally agree with you. Yoga is progressing to something more modern because people are progressing and there's more types of people getting on the mat, and honoring that while still paying reverence in whatever way works best for you and that feels authentic and genuine to the lineages, to the background, is important, while still providing this space for different bodies to move uniquely and for people to enjoy it and come back to it. And I always, for me, when I think of like, what is the yoga for me, I think of it as providing this space, this flow space that I can get into, or this release that I can then use to better achieve my meditation practice or be in a better headspace when I leave. So that is what I think of as like my yoga. And Authentic Movements has given me that. And I'm very, very grateful. I know it's not that for everybody, but for those who like creative practice and those who like flowing in weird ways, we wanted to create something that would allow for that same kind of space to play with your own creative language, and also perhaps to provide this outlet so that when you do leave the mat, because I think for a lot of us, not all of us, but for a lot of us, it's that feeling of laying in your final resting posture, sitting in your final resting posture, and then walking off and feeling different than when you first got on the mat, that most of us are searching for. And that is essentially what my yoga is. And I think how we get there looks so different for different people.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that answer, because there is, the definition for things can be different for everybody. And the definition of what my yoga practice is probably going to be very different than what my neighbor's yoga practice is. But it's still yoga to me and it's still yoga to that person. So I appreciate that answer. And, I think, turning it around and asking people what they think yoga is when they ask that question or when they make that statement, this doesn't seem like yoga. It allows that person to really got to get introspective and find their own answer. Because I think a lot of times when if we just, tell somebody what their answer is, like, hey, I don't think this is it. Well, this is my answer to that. A lot of times they can cut. That's not the openness for a conversation, But if we turn that back around, yeah, exactly, right. But the Socratic method, where it's like, okay, I'm not going to tell you an answer. I'm going to ask you a question to lead you to your own answer, and then through that leading to your answer, you might unpack the understanding that the statement that you made doesn't really hold merit, right? Or the statement that you made might not be fully embraced and understood because you don't actually understand the question you're asking, because you haven't defined what yoga is in your own head. So I love that, turning it back around and just giving somebody the opportunity to just kind of marinate on that for a minute. Yeah.
I think that's part of the philosophy of Authentic Movements, is also just people want these clear-cut answers, right? They want these simple answers. What is the right or wrong way to do this warrior two? Are the hips completely open to the side of the mat, or is the back leg internally rotated? And they come to us with these questions, and my question back to them is usually like, well, what is the focus of today's class? Or why might it be helpful to find internal rotation of the back leg in some instances or for some people? Or what are we trying to achieve today? Mm-hmm. When would this way work better? When would that way work better? For what audience? For what purposes? And I think that can be really scary when people first come in, because it's much easier to just memorize like the right and the wrong way to do things, mm-hmm. and then just stick to that without question. But when you realize the level of nuance and also the level of just ridiculousness when it comes to these tiny little details of, do we turn our feet out 10 degrees or in 10 degrees? There is this blossoming of freedom, both with like, I can change these things up to better fit my body, and also sometimes it doesn't matter.
Right. That's that's such a big message. There's so many times that I've gotten the question of like, show me the picture of what this pose is supposed to look like. Like, no, that's not it at all. Like, your body is going to be different than the picture of the person's body I show you. And even if you physically look similar, you might have different injuries. They might have different injuries, you know? I mean, you take the very first Bikram book that came out in like the 70s. The person on the cover, there was a woman on the cover and Bikram's behind her. I think she's in a side angle pose of some sort. And, you know, in back in those days, alignment was key. Like, it had to be perfect. Like, there wasn't the understanding of like our bodies are different. So my knee might not be able to go to over my ankle, right? But in side angle, like your base, like your knee, front knee, right knee is right over the ankle, back leg is opened up, knife edge of the foot is put in, right? So, but in this picture, the front knee is protruding past the big toe, right? Past the front toe, and which is like a big no in yoga, right? And so like my message to them is like, well, this is the person that developed, quote unquote, that put this style out there for the masses and was very, very strict about alignment and structure, but the picture that he put on the cover of his book is out of alignment, right? So listen to your body. Listen to your body. You might want to get your hip right in line with your knee, but if your hip and your hamstrings are super tight, then lift that hip up above the knee, get your hip stretched out, and then maybe sink down a little bit, right? But it's not one pose fits all. And for teachers, like you were saying, I thought that would be freeing for teachers at first, because it was freeing for me when I finally figured that out when I went through my own teacher training. It's like, I don't have to memorize this dialogue verbatim, word for word. I can understand the sequence. Take Hatha, for example. I can understand that there's a sequence that I want to follow. But within that sequence, I'll get him in the pose, and then I look around the room and I teach from the room. So if Mary has her left hip forward and I want her to pull her left hip back, I'll teach that to everybody. Okay, everybody pull your left hip back, expand on the inhale, come down on the exhale. You know, so you're teaching to that entire room. So a lot of times, like, I thought that was freeing. I'm like, that's awesome. I just don't have to do that. I understand body movement. I'm going to look at the bodies and teach from there. But for a lot of students, they're like, but it's not on my paper. It's not. I don't know how to memorize it. Where is that coming from? Well, let's work with whatever we have, right? If memorizing for you is a good starting point, we'll memorize, and then we'll start to like figure out what your strengths, where to play to your strengths at. But yeah, that memorization was really, really tough for me, and the freedom to just teach to the room was like one of the best breaths of fresh air I've ever taken teaching yoga. With
I feel that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, so with so you got into yoga, you had a lot of aerial background, you've had a lot of dance background, ballet, but gymnastics. So my youngest kid right now is in gymnastics, and what you had mentioned earlier about unsupported getting into to back bends and things like that. That's one of the things that I'm working with her the most on right now, is because she's 13. She's super flexible. She can be like standing in the living room, just woke up from bed. It's like, hey, look, Dad, and just drop back into a standing back bend. I'm like, oh my God, like, good for you. But was your core engaged? Did you stretch first? Like, did you breathe when you inhaled and started to lift and exhaled and come down? Like, come on, girl, let's work on this. And that's one of the hardest things for me to get through to her, is that just because your body can doesn't mean it will be able to forever. So the more you can find engagement to move into these poses with purpose and with meaning, instead of just dropping into the splits all of a sudden, you know, there's the longevity. You can do that when you're my age, right? And so I love that approach that you have with that. With your inversion training, so it seemed like all of that kind of led into to where you're at with inversions now. How did you parlay all of that background into this more engaged, more methodical way of experiencing inversions and then also teaching them?
Whew, okay, a big question. Well, certainly it took a lot of exploring, I think, on my own first, with my own inversion practice. When I first came back into the world of yoga after aerial, I was really into inversions, but I wasn't quite at this place where I was considering not even alignment, but just activations and awareness. I was relying on my natural hypermobility and even just the mind mapping of my past and what I remembered it felt like in my body to do some of these movements. And that wasn't great. And it took some time. It took a combination of things, right? I have studied under a variety of teachers, some who are super flowy, fluid, and really rely on hypermobility to get into things without any details. They don't care. It's about creativity. And some that are extremely, extremely alignment based, moving down to the littlest toe. What can we do to change this in all these little ways? And I knew I liked aspects of both, but extremes always feel just that extreme to
Yeah.
me. So finding something in the middle that would help marry this creative side that I get from dance and from choreographing and gymnastics, because I always loved floor and I loved more the dance aspect of gymnastics. And also I have a background in anatomy and physiology. It's what I studied in college. I love, I'm very analytical. Like I do the business side of things, and I have until very recently run the business until we hired a business admin. And I love that side of my brain too. So I like organizing and putting things into parts. And I think that combining those aspects and combining both sides of my brain is what really made me realize, like, why am I not thinking about this more? Like, it might be harder at the beginning, right? It might be harder to actually think like, oh, what activations or what changes might help me feel more comfortable in this handstand prep or this press prep, and not just comfortable while I'm in it, but comfortable afterwards. So I'm not in pain afterwards, and also comfortable 5 years from now, so that I can't, that I don't achieve this tomorrow, but then I have major low back pain a decade from now. And I'm lucky too, in that I have a partner who's very into strength and conditioning and is also massively knowledgeable when it comes to anatomy and the human body. And together, through exploring in the weight room, adding some strength and conditioning so that I could better control my hypermobile range of motion. And I really started to personally see the effects in my practice, specifically when it came to inversions, but with everything, a lot with back bends as well. And I started to apply those to my teaching and saw great success there. And it's certainly been a journey. There's a reason why I pulled my initial books, which were out there. I had about 4 books that were out there, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I pulled them before the pandemic, because I was like, ooh, how I teach now, the language that I use, I try to avoid nocivos, and just everything has changed.
Yeah.
And so I pulled all those because we grow as teachers. And I think we do that through our own practice, and then also through individual study outside of the modality.
Yeah, most definitely. That's pretty gutsy to pull some previous knowledge that you've had out there to pull back in, based off of your new information that you've developed. That's great. Did that so is that one of the things that parlayed you into putting this new book out, kind of more of what your current teaching structure and ideas about yoga are?
Yeah, so I had 4 books before. They were handstand pressing, full body back bends, and starting a yoga practice. And all of them felt fine. I mean, they had good information in there. But the language that I use, full of nocebo, so full of danger language, like protect, watch out, be careful of. And after my study with a variety of physiotherapists and just people more conscious of how the nervous system works, I wanted to avoid nocebos and focus on the fact that the body is resilient, especially when we're doing these body weight or body movement practices. And then also I just have amassed a great deal more information, specifically about handstand and pressing, when over the last 5 years. Yeah. So I made the decision, and I have since relaunched the handstand book, which nearly tripled in size, and then obviously changed the language. And we'll be relaunching the pressing book in about a week or 2. And I'm thinking about the full body back bends one, but I won't be relaunching the starting a yoga practice. I just think that that's not necessarily in my wheelhouse. I'm trying to niche down a little bit more with more creative flow and then inversions. So there's a lot of people out there who are great with beginners and who know much more about starting a yoga practice. So I'm stepping away from that and focusing more on what I feel really passionate about, and that is making inversions somewhat more accessible and fun. And then also the same thing with back bends, because I think when we think about back bends or spinal extension and hip extension in yoga, we either think, oh, I'm really good at that because we have this natural hypermobility, or, oh, I'm really bad at that, I hate those, I try to avoid them. And so finding some more nuance there and how we can work with our ranges of motion, both on the really stiff and the really hypermobile side, is enjoyable for me. And it's like this fun puzzle that I get to solve, because again, analytical side, love to solve puzzles and organize things.
I know. I love when a student comes to me and is like, can you help me with this? I'm like, oh yes, let's help. Where can I poke? Okay, let's activate that. Let's move that here. Okay. Ooh, wow, look at you. You're grabbing your foot. All right. We're doing things. That's back bends was one of my first, the first things that I wanted to embrace. I was terrified of back bends. One of the reasons I got into yoga was I had a terrible low back. I was in restaurants for about 20 years. Just that industry itself, whether you're standing, carrying. I mean, we worked in bars, so there's a lot of keg lifting, all that shit. So my low back was just trashed. And so that's when I got into yoga. And then when we started to look into back bends, I was terrified of back bends. I'm like, I'm going to break myself in half. Like, there's no way if I look at the wall, if I look at the ceiling, I don't think I'm going to get back up. And but the wheel, the yoga wheel, the Dharma wheel, that 12-inch, that was the thing that really gave me confidence and allowed me to build a structured practice in a back bend without like feeling so vulnerable. And at that time, I didn't even realize why I was feeling vulnerable. I didn't even know that word, really, honestly, to be fair. But there was like this panic that would happen when I go into a back bend, and I didn't realize at the time. But I was like, I felt so exposed, like the whole front side of my body's open. You know, energetically, that's where our chakras all lie. So there's this big energetic opening, you know. And then biologically, you know, animals as apes, you know, most animals walk on their hands, on their four hands and feet, right? And so when we walk like that, our back and our ribs cover all of our vital organs. So when we stand upright, we're already vulnerable because now all of our vital organs are showing. And then when we go into back bend, it's like, hey, kill me, open up, I'm right here, right? So like all this psychological stuff that I didn't really realize at the time was all just flooding through my head of all this panic and all this craziness that, you know, once I finally was able to find the wheel and find a teacher that could really work with me in my back bends, with the breath and work with the confidence, man, that was it changed my whole life. Like there was a layer that I was almost removed of all this, like these preconceived stories and all this like this protection that I needed to keep around myself, because like this is all I know. I can't move out of this small box. And then once I was able, like almost given permission to move out of that box and explore back bends, and then back bends built confidence to explore arm balances, and arm balance built confidence to explore handstands, you know. And it's, you know, there was that playfulness that was so missing in my life that I didn't even know. Right. You know, I was such a staunch parent. I was a corporate guy. I was working my ass off. I was trying to, you know, keep my family going, and I lost all my ability to play. And so yoga was one of those first opportunities for me to really kind of give myself permission to come back and play and be playful and understand that there was something outside of like just balancing your life, right? Just balancing your family with your work. Like there needs to be some aspect of play in there as well.
I love what you said about finding confidence in your back bend and how that led to confidence elsewhere in your practice and also off the mat. And I think it's so important
Yeah.
to give people some sense of win or success. And that's why if people are teaching these really complex movements or really complex transitions, taking the time to break them down into these regressions or these posture mimics or transition mimics with props or on your back or on your side is such a helpful factor, so that we can feel the sensations in our body, make the shapes beforehand, and also provide these stepping stones where people realize that they can get off the bus or stay on a stepping stone at any place within the practice. And right there, you're just planting these seeds of confidence. Like, look, I can do it here. I might not be ready for that next step, but I can do it here. And I have that success and I have that effort and work now. And I think that really does spread elsewhere in the practice. And, you know, everyone comes to me for inversions, and we used to travel around and do a lot of workshops, and we did inversion workshops, but I also pressed a lot of like hip opening lotus workshops and then also back bend workshop. And I would always do this little talk at the beginning of the back bend workshop that it's funny because people come to me for inversions, and sure, I have a lot of knowledge about inversions from practicing myself and also just from taking a million billion workshops to look at how different people teach inversions in different ways for different audiences. But inversions have not necessarily been easy for me, but there's something that comes somewhat naturally. When you start young, when you're 3 or 4, I didn't have the fear of going upside down. And I was used to kind of throwing my legs in there. There was always a playful nature to my inversions, because when, you know, you're a little kid and you throw your legs up in the air to do a handstand, how are you not playful?
Right.
And that wasn't the case for back bends. Back bends were something that were very challenging for me because I felt I had some flexibility in my lower back, like most of us, but I couldn't really connect to my thoracic or my upper back. And I'm sure partly that's due to everything you said as far as like the biological and the psychological aspects of what's going on with protecting our organs too. But also just like the physiological aspect of not being able to connect my mind to that part of my body. And that's why I love things like the Dharma wheel, where we're physically putting something there. I love props,
Yeah.
but we're physically putting something there to say, hey, brain, like this is my mid spine. It's okay to let it relax a little bit out of flexion and to soften a bit there. We have the availability to find space and movement there. And my exploration and growth with back bends has definitely led to much greater changes in my practice than I would say my inversion work, simply just because I had a lot longer of a ways to go there. And so I think when we struggle with things personally ourselves, it provides us this much greater toolbox as far as teaching goes. So I've had to create that toolbox for inversions by obviously discussing with people that I'm teaching and working with, taking other outside workshops of like how to teach people to go upside down when they're just terrified of being upside down. Because for me, like, I was never terrified of being upside down, but I know a lot of people are.
Yeah.
So I had to search for outside tool sets there. But with back bends, like they've been a massive personal struggle. And so my work around there has made me a better teacher as far as teaching them to other people, because I get the frustration.
Right.
And I get just feeling like you're hitting this wall. So I feel you on that. And I love props, and they've certainly helped my back bend practice as well.
Yeah. Well, I just put it together, that authentic side, the authentic and authentic movements. One of the biggest things I love to say is teach from your authentic place. And when we teach from our authentic place, like from our injuries, from our successes, from our failures, from all the things we're learning, like we're right there with the students, right? And that's, I love the way you just described your back bends. That's you're learning, you're like teaching from a place of where you've learned as well. Like you were saying, inversions were easy for you. That's like, okay, cool. But back bends were like, oh my God, that's terrifying. And so when we have that understanding of what the terror can be, and not just the fun side of it, there is that aspect of, okay, let's slow this down. I see the fear in your eyes, or I see what you're going through. Let's make this more approachable in some kind of way. Let's bring a wall into it. Let's bring two supporters into it. What kind of props can we do to make you feel safe? Because that's really what it is. Like once we build that confidence and we can overcome our own personal hurdles, that message that we have to ourselves is so strong subconsciously. It's the counter of, like, let's say I'm going to tell myself I'm going to go work out today after we're done with this interview. I'm going to go work out. I tell it in my head. I'm going to do my practice. But then our interview finishes. I end up doing 10 other things. And then I convince myself that, no, I don't need my practice. I've already got stuff to do. Well, I basically lied to myself, right? I've told myself a lie. And if I can't fully believe myself, how am I going to fully believe the human across from me, right, on a subconscious level? So when we can create these success moments for ourselves, when we challenge ourselves in a way and we conquer that challenge, or we face that challenge, not even conquer it, maybe we're crying in our back bend, and that's exactly what we needed to do because we needed that release, but you're still in that place. You're opening that vulnerability. That does something to our physiology that is so beautiful, that creates trust, it creates understanding, it creates belonging, and that's where the magic happens. The magic for me, like just, drawing a weird dotted line from yoga, I'm terrified of heights. I've been terrified of heights. I have an unrational fear of heights. I don't know why. I've never had an incident to where I feel like I've had, have a reason to be afraid of heights, but I am. And but so in the past 2 years, I started doing bouldering at our local rock gym to help me try to get over that fear of heights. And by doing that, I'm utilizing the strength that I've built in my yoga practice to be confident in the understanding that my hand is going to hold this hold. My foot is going to be on that foothold. And then I can move my hand to this next one. And I can feel the strength in my body moving me from side to side. Now, granted, I'm not going 20 feet up in the air. I'm still about 5 feet off the ground. But I'm still building that confidence to know that I can hold myself here. And I can feel the core strength. And I'm like, oh my God, this is my yoga off the mat today, is developing my confidence to where I can not, hopefully not have a fear of heights anymore. It's just, there's so many ways that we can take our practice off the mat once we understand like how beautiful this modality of healing can be.
Not to mention that rock climbing is an absolutely fabulous counter practice for yoga with all the grip work and pulling actions.
Right.
Yeah,
that's one of the,
it over there.
Yeah. We don't do a lot of pulling in yoga until I got to my back or to my inversion practice. I didn't really feel like my upper back got a lot of workout. And but once I got into inversion, I'm like, oh damn, all right, now we're just working the shoulders. My hands have become my feet now. I gotta build the shoulder girdle up.
For sure, it does definitely add into shoulder stability, and I completely agree with you there. I think the struggle itself is somewhat essential, and finding those little bites of success is also somewhat essential. And keeping that balance in between is the challenge, right? And the hard part. But also the joyful part
It
when you
is.
can find it and it spreads to other parts of your practice or your life.
Yeah. So with your inversions and your inventive sequencing, like the sequencing that you have on your Instagram, and that's mainly where I've seen your sequencing is the reels that you put up, and they're so fun and they're so inventive, and there's a lot of rain involved sometimes, and there's like beach sand and like little kids and stuff. Like it's dogs, like they're so beautiful. I love how it's just like, oh, it's yoga time. Okay, everybody, you can gather around if you want to, or get out of the way. But I'm going to do some yoga here. Okay, so as a yoga teacher myself, and I love inventive sequencing. I love when teachers are like, hey, we're going to do some shit you've never done before. I'm like, yes, let's do this. Because one, I love hearing how people cue things because I'm just a nerd like that. But also like putting me into these sequences are just so beautiful. So two-part question. Like one, how do you develop the sequencing? Because some of the shit you do, I'm like, where in the hell I mean, it makes complete sense. As soon as I see you do it, I'm like, yeah, okay, I can see how, like a bird of paradise can move into like a forward fold, into a somersault, into a Johnny Sharasana. I'm like, yeah, I would never have done that, but I can see the flow of how your body moves that way. That's beautiful. So how do you figure that out, one? And then like the cueing side of that, how do you teach that into a class? Because that's the part that I'm like, I really want volume on this because I want to hear what you're saying right now.
Sure. So this is a wonderful question. And it really comes down to, okay, first of all, what is authentic movements? And when we talk about authentic movements in our school and just as an idea, it's going to look different for everyone, which can be frustrating, right? Because everybody's creative language is going to be different on the mat. But when we talk about an authentic movements pocket or an authentic movements piece of practice, what we mean, myself, Erin, and Bianca, is a small portion, maybe 5 to 15 minutes of play without rules. So what you're looking at a lot of the time on my Instagram is my authentic movements pocket. I might do a more structured practice. It can still be weird and funky, but a more structured practice for, 45 minutes or so. And then I might spend 5 to 15 minutes in play, an authentic movements pocket where I put on my favorite music or I go out in the rain and I just get wild before I do a counter and a cool down. And that can look different. It could be, a 30-minute warm up and then maybe a longer authentic movements practice and then a closeout or the opposite. But what we're doing there is essentially warming up the body and getting the structured practice, what I really need out of the way, right? Like, oh, my hips are really tight today. I'm going to work on them a little bit. And then once I feel like I've had a substantial warm up, and that's going to look different for different people, it becomes an opportunity to play and to create. And it's hard because sure, we want to create things and right, we want to make these beautiful, unique transitions that everybody oohs and ahs over, both on social media, but also within your class, right? But to try to step away from that as a goal and to just say, if there's no rules and I don't have to balance this out on both sides and I don't have to do anything that is considered specifically pure yoga, right? If I can just roll around on the floor, if I can just get weird and almost try to step outside of my brain and let my body just move, how will it move? And so an authentic movements practice or an authentic movements pocket is simply that, freedom of movement. And we tell people 90, 95, 99% of the movements that you do in an authentic movements practice, you might never do again. You might be like, oh, that was weird. But when we really let ourselves flow and get into it and start to realize that there is this available space to just freeform play, sometimes a golden nugget comes out and you know it almost right away when it happens. You're like, what did I just do? I just moved from like goddess into that just weird twisty pretzel thing and somehow I ended up like on my back and it felt great. I'm going to try that again. And so we latch onto that and then we play with that transition and maybe that becomes a focal transition in a class that you teach later down the road. Now, that doesn't necessarily work right away for everyone, right? Some people get to an authentic movements pocket and you could tell whether they're new to the practice, they're just like, they just look around and see what's happening. So we always give people a starting place, especially if it's a new or maybe a 200 level training or even just a creative sequencing intensive. We'll have taught a funky sequence and we'll say something like, all right, now this is authentic movements pocket. Here's what we're doing, freeform movement. You don't have to worry about ever doing these things again. What you're trying to do is just get out of your head a little bit and play. But if that seems scary or complicated, take the flow that we just did and start doing it a little bit faster now. You're more comfortable with it. Take out some of the alignment details and then change a few things about it. What do you want to change? What would be more interesting for you than transitioning from goddess into this twist into cowboy's pose? Try something new, do something different. And then people will start to make a few different changes. And hopefully over time, they can get to this place where they do feel like they can do free form play. We also do specific creative sequencing drills, especially around props, where we might do some form of animalistic movement first and then take blocks and say like, okay, you know, we know how we can use blocks in a supportive manner or something like under our hands, under our feet. But if we're working towards side pro, what are all the different ways that I can use blocks to help the activations for this pose? So we'll be more specific in this creative play, and that can help you find weird positions, weird transitions, and things specifically with props. But of course, you can do it without props too. And through this combination of exercises, we often start to develop a bank or a library of weird and unusual transitions. And I think within authentic movements, we all organize those in different ways. Like I am, again, the really analytical one. I have like a Dropbox that is full of, you know, hips, and then within hips it'll be like external rotation, and then it'll be flexion work and things like that, where I have these little videos, because I often even just video my authentic movements practice, because like you said, cueing this is a whole nother factor, and even remembering what you did, writing it down for yourself, or like that weird twisty thing from goddess to pretzel fold, and then you look at it later and you're like, oh my gosh, what was I even talking about? I know it was cool. So I video it, and then I'll crop the video to like, you know, a little 17-second clip, and I'll throw it in my Dropbox. And then when I'm feeling uninspired, or I want to develop a class and I want it to be full of fun transitions or lead up to this cool peak flow, I'll go pick 2 or 3 that are relevant from my library. And then I'll work those in. So yes, the public classes or the teacher trained classes I teach are still very weird. They incorporate a lot of unusual transitions. Are they quite as weird as my authentic movements pocket that people often see on my gram? No, usually not, just because for a lot of people that would be really inaccessible and really overwhelming. Yeah. So we always say there's so many things to look at when you're sequencing creatively. For yourself, that's one thing, right? Because we don't have to cue ourselves. As long as we can remember the general aspect of what we're doing, we're good to go. But then when we're teaching others, there's this aspect of overwhelm from just them doing new things. Like, ooh, at what point will people be overwhelmed? Do we want every transition to be weird and wacky? Right. No, probably we want to give them these pockets of familiarity. And then there's also, does your ability to sequence mimics and regressions and your ability to cue effectively and efficiently match up with your ability to sequence? And I think that is often the most frustrating thing for new teachers, is that they are able to sequence extremely creatively. And especially when we go through and we break down, like, what is a mimic? What is a regression? How can we take this complex movement and make it simpler so that we can sprinkle these little ideas or these little almost foreshadowing aspects into the class? And that is really effective, but it's much harder to cue that succinctly and effectively without overwhelming people. So often when people start, their personal practice might look a lot more creative than their teaching, and that's okay. I think it takes time. A lot of us come into this with a background in movement ourselves, but not necessarily a background in communication. I was lucky in that I had taught both gymnastics, I taught dance, I taught aerials. I've also even just done a little bit of teaching itself as far as kids, and you really learn to be succinct when that goes. And so communication has been something that was a strong point, but I'm certainly still honing over time. And the more creative and the more weird you are, I think the more focus on the prior sequencing, those regressions and the mimics, but even more how you're cueing them and how you're bundling those cues becomes essential. Yeah. And that was a really long-winded answer. I know here I'm talking about succinctness, but it's a complex topic, right?
It is. And you know what? It's so, I love that answer so much. This is our first conversation together personally, but there's so much verbiage and so much dialogue that you're using in the way that you describe that I've adapted to as well. And I had to, probably you as well had to learn it the hard way, right? Like when I Yeah, I love inventive sequencing. That's one of my favorite things. And as a brand new yoga teacher, I had had a 3-year practice. I had had a lot of mentors in the yoga community that were amazing teachers that I really tied myself to, that had inventive practices, teaching practices. So when I started teaching, in my background, I did corporate trainings and stuff like that. So I'm pretty, used to holding space and being up in front of big groups of people. So that wasn't a learning curve for me. It was more of how do I deliver this message of yoga in the most applicable way, right? And I fell into the shiny new toy syndrome. Like I had all these toys that I wanted to play with. Hey, look at all these transitions, all these cool things I'm doing, all this breath work and all these things. And I got a lot of just like sideways confused dogs of like, what is this? And it wasn't it. And I kind of streamlined it a little bit, and I got to a pocket to where I understood what I was doing. But like I was telling you earlier, COVID was a big thing for me to where I could start to explore like what you call your authentic movement pockets. That was something I was doing, but not, hadn't had a name to it. And just working through different weird transitions that I would go through and be like, oh, wow, that was interesting. Maybe I can teach that into a class. But that familiarity piece, that was one that once I found the familiarity piece, that was the game changer for me, because you can have all these beautiful transitions and these cool new things that you want to throw in there. But if people don't feel successful with whatever they're practicing, then they're not getting out of what they need to get out of it, right? It's not always what I want to teach. It's what the students are willing to learn and willing to accept. And so, okay, cool. So I'm gonna have a really cool, inventive opening sequence, right? We're gonna open the body up in a very nice, beautiful, slow, inventive way, and then we're gonna do like a warrior sequence, right? I'm going to get you back into your familiarity. We're going to go through crescent lunge, warrior to reverse warrior, go to chaturanga, right? Nice and slow, get that familiarity back. And then that next sequence I'll throw in a cool, interesting transition to start it off, come back into a normal transition or a traditional transition, and then kind of go from there. And I got so much better feedback from the students of like, oh my God, I loved the new stuff you threw in. They didn't say anything about the traditional things, but they were actually able to comment now on the new things because everything wasn't new. Right? It wasn't everything was from the ground up, a brand new thing that they'd never learned, a new transition that I just learned that I don't really understand myself, And so now it was like, okay, I'm going to give you familiarity, which allows me familiarity, allows me to not have to overthink about everything, and then just pepper in the cool little new toys that I figured out that I think would land with you guys. And so like that piece for me was super hard to find, but once I found it, it made so much more sense. And that's, there's the woman that, one of the women that took your training her name's Tana Graham from this area.
Oh, I love Tana.
She's great. She has beautiful things to say about every single one of y'all. Her experience there was fantastic. But we had a conversation about that one time, and she had mentioned something. I didn't put it together, but she had mentioned something about that pockets of familiarity. How do we push, but we also still give the opportunity for success?
And it's for both sides. It's for the student, and it's also for us to just have a break and just breathe, because it's so many words and it's so much thinking. I think there's this level of bravery when you teach creatively, and this level of massive effort. And no shame to those teachers who just have a few sequences memorized or just create a sequence on the fly because they're teaching so often. Like, you do what you have to do. Mm-hmm. But if you're wanting to teach, people are teaching 45 or 60-minute classes. And if you're trying to get to this massively complex sequence as your pinnacle, as your peak, you have to really consider every moment of the class and how you can utilize every moment of the class to better get where you're going. And that's through a mix of introducing the new things and providing these pockets of familiarity that maybe the pockets of familiarity still push you on the path to where you're going, but there's something somewhat simple. And so I think that there is this extra level of effort where you can't just be like, all right, I'm going to do some like cat cow, some sunbird, and then thread the needle, I don't know, wide-legged forward fold, and then we'll get into working into my flow. Mm-hmm. Like, because you've just taken the first 15 minutes or so of class where you could have taken those warm-ups and used them to go where you're going, and more efficiently. But it can feel like a lot of work, especially when you first get started in this journey of sequencing creatively, because you probably will spend way more time writing your class and figuring out how to say things, and then you'll teach it and people will be like, I was really confused at one point. And that will give you great feedback of like, oh yeah, probably need to highlight that or add in some more familiar pockets beforehand so people feel refreshed and ready to take on this new transition. And it looks different for different audiences too. When we get to the end of our 300-hour program or whatever, I can usually put less familiar places and new things versus at the beginning, I'll have more familiar pockets and just a couple of new transitions. So I think knowing your audience is helpful. And if you are teaching like a 6-week kind of step to whatever crow pose or to handstand, that you can start to get a little bit weirder as you go on, as people start to get to know you. But
yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of work and effort.
Yeah, that I love teaching regular classes because of that nature exactly. You know, I know the students, I know their practices, I know what they're working on, but they also know what I'm working on and the way that I teach. And not to say that I don't welcome new students, I welcome them all the time, but having that group of weird students that love the weird way that I teach, you know, it almost gives me that the carte blanche to still explore the weirdness, but also knowing that, you know, Jim is working on backbend, so I'm going to throw some really nice safe backbends in for Jim before we get explorative with other stuff, you know, or, you know, Jane really likes crow pose, so I'm going to throw some crow in for Jane, you know, and get her that success that she feels, you know, and there's that level of, you know, like we're working together through this, right? Yes, I'm the one up here like dictating the class, but I'm also learning as much as you're learning, and I love the feedback that you guys give me after class. You know, that's one of my favorite things is after class, like people just, one, they're cracked open so they can talk about whatever they want to and not feel weird about it. But two, it's like, hey, this weird transition that you did in there, can you break it down for me out here? And then it's like, yes, I can. Let's, everybody that wants to, that has time, get around and let's break this down together, right? Because that's going to help me understand how you're receiving this transition, and also you can start to, you know, dissect some of the weird dialogue that I might be using that might not land in the right way. You know, so it's like this give take of like, hey, we're all learning together, you know, and that's one of the most beautiful things is like, yes, I am the quote unquote instructor, but all I'm doing is holding the space. I'm giving you options for postures. If they don't land with you, you can do something different. And then let's talk about this shit after class.
I love that.
Yeah. With your teacher trainings, you guys had a pretty successful teacher training going into COVID. And then I'm assuming with everybody, you had to pivot in some kind of way. How was that pivot for as intense, not intense, but intricate, I guess. Intricate is the way that the way you present through your yoga practice. Do you think that, well, one, did you have to do Zoom? And then two, do you think that it was received, or are you having to go back and kind of like adjust things after that? Or like, how did that process work out for you guys?
Oh, well, it's been a continual pivot, and we are still pivoting. But yes, you're right. We did teach beforehand. We taught online previously. We've taught online for a long time before COVID, but not necessarily teacher trainings, more packages and bundles in a pre-recorded style fashion. And then we taught in-person teacher trainings here at the retreat center that my husband and I built in Costa Rica. And they were wonderful. They were, you know, a month to 6 weeks long, wow, depending on if it was a 200 or 300 hours. So we're talking about a massive commitment, and you build so much community and you really get to know each other and work well together. But even during and slightly after those, we saw the downsides of that, in that from an accessibility standpoint, not everybody can take that kind of time off or wants to. From a digestion standpoint, you don't really have a lot of time. There's a limited amount of time where we can ask questions, where you can really apply and digest the information before we've moved on to something else. Because when we're talking about 200 or 300 hours, it's a lot of information. Yeah. And we generally like to pack like 250 or 350 hours into our trainings, just because we don't feel like it's enough, even though it's a lot of information. And so when we had to pivot to online, sure, it was frustrating because we didn't want to rush, and we knew we didn't want to. Everybody, it felt like a lot of people, and again, people were doing what they had to do, so no shame there, but it felt like a lot of people were just being like, okay, well, we'll just take our training and we'll do it live stream through Zoom. And I appreciate if that's something that people had to do, but I knew that that wasn't what I wanted, because it felt like it would be the same thing without as much community and just a little bit more challenging with all the technology and things. And so we spent a little time, about 6 months, recording parts of our 200 hour, because we decided to launch that one first, in a way that the majority of the information was pre-recorded, so people could do it on demand. Because that also felt like, with the pandemic, so many people had different things going on, whether they were having to shift their work from home. We knew that getting people to commit to a specific Zoom schedule, especially intense one, didn't seem like something that we wanted to do and that a lot of other people wanted to do. So we converted our 200-hour to an on-demand system that still provided personalized feedback and live teaching check-ins. So with our 200-hour, the majority was pre-recorded, but they would submit assignments through our LearnDash platform, and we would send videos back of us specifically giving feedback, both positive, wow, this is so amazing, and some constructive thoughts about their teaching and their cueing and their practice. And then also there were points throughout that program where they would reach a stopping point that said like live teaching, where they'd have to check in with a small group in Zoom. And so we're still running those 7 days a week. We have a Zoom at a different time so that we can hit our students in different time zones, where if you're at that place in the program, you have to check in with a group of up to 6 and a teacher and do a live teaching. And with that live teaching, you'll then get feedback from the teacher and the other people who are there. And then you can move on to the next segment. So that felt like the best of both worlds for us, as far as letting people work at their own pace, because some people would do a chapter a day and some people will do a chapter a month and slowly work through it, but still, especially with the 200-hour, getting to a place of checking in and making people feel like they had that feedback for growth. It's a lot of work on our side, having that kind of happen 7 days, and then also just the cost of hosting these online platforms for months and months and months on end. So at the moment, the 200 hours closed. We closed it at the end of June to new registrations. There are still people going through it. They'll be going through it till the end of next summer. But that we decided to put on pause while we focus on the 300-hour, because we also did pivot the 300-hour during the pandemic. We did 2 versions, a completely on-demand version where we pre-recorded things and then had some places where they get video feedback for the practicum. Because at 300-hour, people already know somewhat about teaching, and it's more about finding their own path and kind of just honing in on that. And we also had a hybrid one where we live streamed the weekends, and during the week, they did the pre-recorded content so that we could connect as a group. And both worked really well. And we used them to develop the next version, which is what we're at today. So we put the 200-hour on pause, and we are now just doing a modular 300-hour. So it's meant for someone with a base 200-hour from any school. And we decided to break it up into modules, partly online, partly in person, because then again, you get the best of both worlds. We want to go back to in person to some degree, right? Because the world is opening back up again, and people are craving that in-person connection. But at the same time, we want the accessibility and we want the digestion of online. So of the 300 hours, we've kept 200 online and 100 in person or live stream, because we know not everyone can make it. And we've broken it up into categories. So for example, on August 1st, our first module launches, and that is the 50-hour movement science and strength. So it has anatomy, it has physiology, it has strength and conditioning, it has practices, it has lectures, and it's taken from both our live stream and our on-demand training, as well as new content that we've recorded to make it feel cohesive. And we also felt that by selling these in these packages, that people could pick and choose, right? Because I know I've done a lot of 200s and a lot of 300-hour trainings at this point. I don't really feel like doing another 300, unless there was a new teacher that I was like, wow, yeah, I just have to go to their training. What I do like doing is picking and choosing what I like. And I like anatomy. So if people like anatomy and they want to jump in and delve a little deeper, they can get the 50-hour movement science and strength. And it comes with some optional pre-work. So in case you weren't in our 200-hour and you're like, I need a refresher, you can jump in and do the pre-work. And then we've taken philosophy and history and bucketed that together for an online module. Business of yoga and marketing, bucketed that together. Creative restorative, practice and teaching, general communication. So those are the modules that are online. And then with the in-person, we took the parts of our 300-hour that are most conducive to group and community. And that's 50-hour creative sequencing deep dive and 50-hour accessible inversions. And those we'll be doing in person in 5-day modules about twice a year for each of them. So the first one's already up. It's this November in Charleston, South Carolina. I want to say it's November 14th through the 18th. And that is accessible inversion. So it's a 50-hour and it's open to anyone. So yes, you can add it to the program, or you could just take it because you're interested in practicing or teaching inversions and you don't need any experience. It's just, do you want to learn about inversions and how to use creative sequencing and how to use props and how to use regressions and mimics to help your personal practice or to teach others? Great, you can do this. And you can put these modules together in any order that you choose. and yeah, build essentially your own program at your own pace. And so that's where we're going with the teacher trainings now. We're putting the 200 on pause because it's not quite as conducive to this any order modular style system. So
Right.
usually people need at least this onboarding module before they can start picking and choosing their segments. I'm sure it'll come back at some point, probably in a hybrid style program, part online and part in person. But I think with a 200-hour foundational, it becomes a little bit more important to think about order and to get everybody on the same page first. So we wanted to focus on the 300 and let people pick and choose the order that they wanted to do things, and then focus on some outside projects as well for those who are not interested in teacher trainings but still want to practice and do funky flows with authentic movement. So we have other surprise things coming up within the next few weeks, actually, for those who are just interested in doing classes or shorter programs with us.
That's great. I think that, that's one of the biggest things right now is like we found out that there's many different ways to present this information. And so finding the best way that your students are going to receive this information and then being able to provide it to them. I think that was one of the biggest takeaways from COVID for me, was that we can now get away from this one size fits all kind of mentality. It's like, okay, so this is my group that I'm working with. This is my group that I'm working with. Let's see how this works with them. I love that you're doing a business and marketing aspect of this. That's one of the biggest things that I think is missing in a lot of teacher trainings is how do I put myself out there? And then how do I build a following? And if I want to be a yoga teacher that's on Instagram or has a YouTube channel, like how do I do that? How do I make sure that, gosh, it's been 10 years since my teacher training now, almost. And it's, there wasn't anything about insurance in there. There wasn't anything about, like the safety of like, if you're doing your own personal yoga practice, not teaching in a studio, so the fact that you're layering that in, especially in the 300-hour, man, that's super important. There's so many times that, you have all these ambitious teachers that love what they're doing and they have all this energy, but they don't know that they don't know how to funnel it, because there's not really avenue out there to say, hey, make sure you have this. I mean, Yoga Alliance was pretty much the only thing that people, I think, hear about on a regular basis. And to be fair, what the hell does Yoga Alliance do for us, as yogis, right? Besides take our money and clock our hours, right? I mean, I'm nothing against Yoga Alliance, but in the 10 years I've been teaching and taking,
plenty of things against Yoga Alliance.
Yeah, I've never actually utilized them for anything that they say that they're able to be utilized for. So I love and I applaud you for putting that aspect in, because I mean, yoga hopefully can become a viable career that people can actually sustain themselves financially on. And that's one of the things that I hope with yoga that we're developing into, is that there's so many beautiful, amazing yoga teachers and people that embrace the practice of yoga, but that don't follow that passion because they can't pay their bills properly. It's not a full-time job. And if you have a full-time job as a yoga teacher, at least up in the Northwest, you're teaching about 15 to 20 classes a week, and that's hard as shit. You're sweating your ass off. You're so mentally involved with all that. And then your personal practice kind of gets bastardized. So hopefully, I mean, there's been talks about up here in this area about different ways to pay yoga teachers based off of class admissions, instead of just $50 a class, which in the beginning it was like, cool, $50 for an hour. But then you realize you're there for almost 2.5 hours. And then there's all this other stuff, the prep that goes into it, playlists that you got to make and developing a content and all this stuff that a 1 hour class turns into about 4 or 5 hours worth of prep work. So, there's that monetary side of it. Hopefully we can start to get better about, but I think putting that in the forefront of what the business side can be and how to market yourself will give the yoga students or the yoga teachers the tools that they need to maybe ask for more money if they feel they desire more money. Have a standardization from yoga student or yoga studios to studios about how much we charge for workshops, and then what the split is. Like right now, I mean, I can go down the street. There's a dozen yoga studios within a stone's throw of my house, and every single one of them is going to pay a teacher differently. They're going to pay them differently based off of the workshops that they do. Some 60-40, some 50-50. Right? There's no standardization in yoga, and not to say that there has to be a blanket standardization, but when there isn't any really standardization about the business side of it, it deters people with a business mind from getting into it. Because like for me, like I grew up in business, and once I started to see the business of yoga, I'm like, it's a little too like fishy out there for me. Like I don't, but the other side of that too is I think there's a big market opening up for consulting for people in this yoga industry or the health and the fitness industry that, you have an inventive yoga teacher that has a great following and they have this beautiful charisma and they decide to open a yoga studio, but they don't have any business aspect, right? And so that great idea and the beautiful following ends up fizzling out because we can't run the business properly. So having people like yourself that has a business background or myself that has a business background to be able to go in and say, okay, let's look at the big picture of what you're trying to accomplish, but then also let's realize this into a business sense and put a business plan together so that you can do this for a long time and that you can sustain your income and provide for your family. And this can be a viable career for you and not just a part-time job, which is what it is for a lot of us.
I am really curious to see what the near future looks like in the yoga world, because I think that things are shifting and changing, at least here in the States. During COVID, a lot of studios had to close or change massively, right, to meet restrictions. And a good number of teachers that I know who were teaching in studios started teaching online. And they made more money. They taught less classes. They made more money. Mm-hmm. They were in charge of themselves. Sure, they had to figure out the technology and things like that, but there was a lot more freedom. And now as things open back up and people go back to the studios because they realize people do want in person, but there's also this aspect of discontent. Like, no, I don't want to go back to making $50 flat a class or $35 flat a class. I don't want that. And I see it from both sides, because being a business owner, I understand that you take the risks and that there's a lot of back end work that people don't even really realize, and back end expenses. Oh my gosh, running an online business is so much more expensive than I thought. I was like, oh, yeah, we'll move online, it'll be great. No, it's so much more expensive from a monthly just expense ledger. But I also see it from the teacher's perspective of like, I'm not down for this anymore. Like, there has to be some kind of incentive. There has to be some kind of changes. So I'm curious to see how the model flexes and develops. And I think that studios have to be willing to be flexible now, because yes, people do want to come back in person, but do all your teachers want to come back in the same way that they did before? And the answer is probably no. And if your studio and your business doesn't support some kind of flexible pay system that incentivizes these teachers to bring in new people, then maybe it's time to revisit that model and to change it somehow. Because, yeah, I think that if people are marketing and bringing more individuals to their class, then they should be paid more than, say, somebody who isn't doing that, right? If you're, and it's hard to measure all these things. These are all variables. These are so challenging, like to measure retention and the students who are coming back and back to find the same teacher, or someone who's bringing new people all the time, but they're not necessarily staying. Like, there's so many different variables involved. So I see that also, but I think things are going to have to change to some degree, just because many teachers have had this taste now of like what it felt like to work somewhat on their own. Mm-hmm. And they may not be willing to teach 15 to 20 classes a week for $35 a class.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think, like you were saying, I think it allows the question to be asked now. Whereas before, maybe we didn't feel comfortable asking the question because that was a standard. This is what we got paid. The classes are at 9:30, 12 o'clock, 4:30, 6, and 7:30. That's just the way it is. Well, now we can ask the questions as to like, well, okay, first off, why are we getting paid just if one class has 50 people and one class has 10 people, and that class that the teacher teaches constantly has 50 people, maybe they should get a cut of, some of the revenue that's coming in for that, right? I don't think that all classes should be based off of admissions, right? There should still be a base level, right? Because we don't want to just bastardize the industry. But that the teacher that can have a full class, every single class that they teach, whether they're teaching a yin class or a vinyasa class, because they have that following or they have that, they speak to their students in a special way. That person, I think, should get compensated in a different way than somebody that is still developing their style and developing their following, or if that's what they're working towards, right? But, but again, I think it's nice that the question is now being able to be asked without just being immediately shot down by an owner of some sort.
Well, I think that's the key. They're asking the question, and not even just on the business side, but that is the key everywhere. I think for too long in the modern Western yoga world, we have not asked questions about, sorry, my little dog's
no, you're good.
about what cues we're saying, about what alignment we are specifying or asking for within our postures, about the way to sequence, about how the business works. People just did what they did because that is what their teacher told them. That is what their studio said the rule was. They didn't ask questions. So I know some people who didn't even ask to see their contract and like read it in detail before they signed it. Or some people who don't even have a contract and they're like, I don't really know. It's just like a handshake agreement. But the same thing translates on the mat too. Like, why do you keep saying that cue? Why is it important? And sometimes people look at you like, what do you mean? Like, oh, I didn't even realize I was saying that cue, or I haven't really thought about why it's important. I learned it from my teacher and I just always say it in this posture. And I think that's the first step, right? This first step is just asking questions, even if it's internally, like, why do I say that? Right. Is it important here? How could I say it in a different way? Or maybe do I need to say it? And for certain that in the business side too, but just this idea of asking questions is paramount to allowing a space for growth.
Mm-hmm. One of the things actually I've learned through this podcast, interviewing many different people that have gone through different lineages of yoga, Baptiste and Bikram were the two main ones that I've heard so far. That if basically the verbatim verbiage that they're taught is, I'm the teacher. You don't ask questions about what the teacher does. You do what the teacher's tells you to. And so I think, that idea of being able to ask questions is kind of a newer thing because people are finally breaking out of those two lineages. Those were the two big lineages. If you wanted to teach Hatha or Bikram, you go to Bikram. If you wanted to teach a power flow of some sort, you went to Baptiste, and now we have yourself, which is awesome. We have all these different offshoots of teaching now that allows the teacher or allows a student to raise a hand and ask a question of like, hey, I don't think this fits right with my body. Whereas before, like especially I think it was with Baptiste, I interviewed a couple people early on in this podcast that it was literally my way or the highway. Don't ask questions. I've told you something. I don't care if I've told you to hold your breath for 10 minutes. Fucking hold your breath, right? I don't care if you don't feel safe doing it. I've told you to. I'm the teacher. Right. And so I think we're finally getting to the place to where we can feel comfortable asking questions and raising our hand without feeling like we're going to be ostracized and now we're not part of that group think anymore. Right. And so like giving giving your students the ability to raise a hand and ask a question, I think that's kind of a newer step in the yoga, in the yoga development at least in the West,
I think that's scary, right? When we first get started, as a teacher, especially, like it's scary to start questioning your own cues, your own sequencing, what you thought of as the rule, because it means you might have to make these outside decisions, or you might realize that there is so much more nuance and that there isn't that easy answer. And that's hard. I understand. I know so many schools who say in their 200-hour teaching, 200-hour training, let students leave with 6 or 8 classes or something like that, and they just have them memorize it. And I get it. Sequencing is hard.
Yeah, totally.
There's so many different ways you can go. There's so many different bodies you might encounter, so many different backgrounds, and all together it makes for this very mixed audience. And so you will never be the perfect teacher for everyone in a class of 30, right? The sequence will never be perfect for everyone. And having that be okay can be a scary thing. And trying to obviously be as inclusive as possible, while still fitting within, whatever you marketed the class for, it's a challenge. And it does take more effort. And when you are teaching 15 to 20 classes a week, it's a lot. And so that's why I think as things change and people are able to focus more on developing their classes and honing their classes and maybe teaching a little bit less because they're making a little bit more, there will be more freedom to play and there will be more freedom to create. And that will look so different for everybody, which is really exciting.
Yeah, most definitely. So I have one more question because I know we have time constraints, but I love asking this question, especially to people like you're like the perfect person to ask this question to. How do you balance your physical and metaphysical life? Like you've got so much going on. You're living in Costa Rica. You're married. You have this beautiful program that you have off the ground, but you're also continuously developing. It seems like you're always pushing yourself to learn and to stay like upfront with your creativity and with what the yoga knowledge is out there and how that's being received. That in itself is exhausting, but you're smiling doing it. You seem like you love what you're doing. I mean, you're in fucking Costa Rica surrounded by dogs and a blue wall. Like it's just, it's a beautiful space. So for yourself, like, how do you balance that? How do you find that balance? And did it take a little bit of time to get there, or was it just like this makes sense?
Okay, so really, truly honest answer, it's not always balanced.
Okay.
And honestly, I feel we're starting to get more to that happy plum point of balance again. But for me, I like working hard and sometimes to a detriment. And before I had a child, an unexpected little toddler, I knew I could always fit more things in. So even if I did a lot of work that day, I could find time for myself, for my personal practice, maybe for some meditation, for some journaling, for some creative work. I was quickly humbled by having a small human and wanting to do more attachment style parenting and wanting to be there for her during her really young years of life, and really realizing my time constraints there, as well as my commitments to the business and just the needs of constantly pivoting during a pandemic. I mean, everything just kind of came at once. My life quickly swung into work. And I didn't have a lot of time for myself. And it was really hard. Should I have made more time? Probably. Should I have asked for help more? Probably. But we did what we had to do, right. And we made it through. And now I'm at this place where I am more comfortable being clear with my needs and my boundaries. I've taken steps. For example, we hired a full-time admin who does most of the back-end emailing and work and website construction and things like that, because I don't need to be doing that anymore. And that's taking away from what could be my time and my place elsewhere. And so part of it has been this relinquishing of control, which is hard for me, but good for me. And also just the humility of realizing, no, I cannot do it all. There are only so many hours in a day. And when small people need you and you need to take care of them, and you only have, say, a 3 to 4 hour window, and then maybe another hour window if she naps later, right. Who knows when that's going to be. You have to pick and choose. And at some point, I have to start pick and choosing myself and not necessarily work. So it's still a continual journey for me, I think, because I do like my work too. And I always say, like, the detriments of being an entrepreneur are that often you do like your work and you never stop working. And when I worked for corporate, I was able to kind of just put my things aside, go home for the day and do whatever. But now, my free time, I have to stop myself from like brainstorming a new class when I'm playing with my little girl. And sometimes that's fine. If we're rolling around the floor, that's a great transition could come out of that, right? But also I have to just remind myself, no, this is not my work time. So I think part of it has become being more strict with myself and being clear with my boundaries of, this is my work time and this is my time to spend as I want, whether that is free form movement, journaling, just laying there on the bed, thinking about nothing. And this is my time to be present with my family. And just being a little bit more clear with that has made it easier, but it's still a work in progress. And we're about to head back to the States for a few months, where we'll be doing construction near Asheville, and we'll be living out in the mountains out there. And, changes with the toddler are always fun. So I'm sure we'll swing into a new balance out there. But I think, as far as finding the balance, just like my practice, it comes and goes, and we're swinging into this place of new balance. I hope to hold on to it a little bit stronger by being clear with my needs, and also just being a little bit more strict with myself that, yes, even if I do like my work, even if I do like creating, I need to put that down sometimes, and I need to do other things for myself.
Amen to that. Amen to that. There's so much work that can be done by when we step away. We can let our mind go away from the thing we've been focused on for so long. It's like, that's when the best answers for me come, is when I actually step away and I realize that I'm just beating my head against this wall for no reason. Like, if I step away, take a breath, walk the dog, do whatever it is, I stop thinking about it. My subconscious is still noodling about it. So all of a sudden the subconscious is like, hey, we got an answer. Boom. It's like, right on. Yeah, this whole time. Good for you.
It's so true. I always come back feeling more refreshed, even if I didn't want to take the break. And even if it takes me a long time to turn off that part of my brain for a little bit, I always come back feeling better.
Damn straight. Well, Stevi, thank you so much. I've had such a joy talking to you, and I greatly appreciate your development of yoga and your practice. I appreciate your contribution to yoga. Like, it's so beautiful to meet people that are really pushing pushing this practice, but also keeping the idea of like the respect in there, and I know that I from this conversation and from what I see, you respect this practice. You respect the way that it's being produced. You respect your students that are coming out of your teacher training programs. Like, there's so much beauty in what you're doing. I can't wait to see, like, continuously what y'all are doing, how you continue to push this practice. And I'm actually excited to read your book. I'm going to get that handstand book. That's one of my favorite things is inversions. I love being upside down on my hands, and the different ways that we can learn to make that approachable to our students, I think, is just the best we can do for our practices.
Well, thank you so much, Adam. It's been a pleasure. And I always love talking about everything yoga and everything inversion. So we'll have to do it again sometime. Thank you so much.
Yeah, most definitely, love. All right, we'll see you soon. Thank you so much for spending time with Stevie and I. I'll leave information and links in the show notes for you to get at us if you have any questions. Please like or subscribe to the podcast and reach out to Stevi or Authentic Movements for any of your yoga needs. Obeisance to love. We'll see you next time.